Hi, I'm Dee Dee West, and this is Broken Limelight. If this is your first time listening, welcome. This is a podcast about true crime and dark stories about celebrities or those in the limelight like rock stars, writers, anybody famous. I am not a journalist or a psychologist or mental health professional of any kind. I am just an entertainer from Las Vegas who enjoys talking about true crime and has a lot of fun facts about celebrities. The reason I am saying all this is because I have a lot of listeners on YouTube who apparently don't realize that this is a podcast. So, if you're new, be forewarned, I do use a lot of profanity, I will laugh at my own jokes, and I'll probably sing at some point. Well, enough about me. Let's talk about John Lennon. John Lennon died on this day, December 8th, in 1980. He was born John Winston Lennon on October 9th, 1940, to his mother Julia Stanley and his father Alfred Lennon. Alfred was a merchant seaman and he was actually away when John was born, which was common. He was often away from home. But he would regularly send paychecks to his wife in Liverpool. That was until 1944 when the checks stopped coming. When Alfred was away at sea, Julia would often leave John with her sisters and she would go out dancing. In 1942, she met a soldier named Taffy Williams, and by 1944, she had become pregnant with Taffy's baby. That relationship didn't work out, and when Alf came back to Liverpool in 1944, he actually offered to look after Julia, John, and Julia's unborn baby. But Julia apparently turned him down and told him that the relationship was over. In June of 1945, Julia gave birth to a baby girl named Victoria Elizabeth. After some pressure from her family, Julia actually gave Victoria up for adoption. John was actually never told about this sister. He found out about her in the 60s when she reached out to him. In 1946, Julia started dating a guy named John Bobby Dykins. The two of them shacked up together in a tiny little flat that only had one bed. Julia's sister, Mimi, didn't approve of this. She thought it was highly inappropriate that the couple and the baby be sleeping in the same bed. He's 6 at this point. Alfred Lennon also came back in 1946, and he didn't approve of this arrangement either. This led to the parents asking John to choose between which of his parents he wanted to live with. John reportedly chose his father, but when Julia started to walk away, he cried after her. They ultimately all agreed that Julia should be the one to care for him. So Alfred went back to the seas and he didn't see John again for over 15 years. When they did get back in touch, John was at the height of Beatlemania and not very eager to get back in touch. So going back, Julia's sister Mimi told Julia bluntly that John sharing a bed with his mother and her new lover was not ideal, and she said, "Let him live with us. We can offer John a better life." However, John's half-sister Julia Baird said in her book, "He was taken from our mother." And notice the word taken, not given up. Torn away was more like it. So allegedly, Julia did try to fight Mimi on this. And her lover, Bobby Dykins, actually threw Mimi out of the flat, and she came back with an official from Liverpool Social Services. So eventually, Julia agreed to give John up to Aunt Mimi and her husband George, basically taking informal custody of John. Mimi's home was more stable, and they seemed to be affluent. Anyway, he's jumping from home to home and family member to family member, and it's said that this resulted in him becoming rebellious. He was a prankster, and he was kind of a smartass, and he was always getting into trouble. Julia would go and visit John as often as she could, and she was actually the one who got him into music and taught him how to play instruments, starting with the banjo and the piano. John and Julia would often sing together, and they would just belt out songs together at the top of their lungs. John became really interested in music, so she bought him his first guitar in 1956. Julia was very, very supportive of John, and John really thought that he could be famous, but Mimi did not agree. She had actually said, "The guitar's all very well, John, but you'll never make a living out of it." In 1956, he formed the band The Quarrymen, which eventually would include Paul McCartney and George Harrison, and then that band would evolve into the Beatles in 1960. Ringo Starr would join the band in 1962. Paul McCartney had said that Aunt Mimi was very aware that John's friends were lower class, and she would often patronize him whenever he came over to their house. It's said, however, that Paul's father didn't approve of John either. He was vocal about how he thought John would get his son into trouble, but he was still very supportive of the band and let them all rehearse at his house. On July 15, 1958, when John was 17 years old, Julia went over to visit him. As she was leaving, she was headed to the bus stop to go home, and she was hit by a car while crossing the street. The driver of this car was a 24-year-old off-duty policeman named Eric Clegg. Clegg was not under the influence of anything at the time, and he was driving under the speed limit, which was something like 30 miles an hour. However, he was a student driver, and he was unaccompanied at the time. So here's a statement from John's childhood friend. His name is Nigel Wally. He said, "I went to call for John that evening, but his Aunt Mimi told me he was out. Mimi was at the gate with John's mom, who was about to leave. We stood chatting, and John's mom said, 'Well, you have the privilege of escorting me to the bus stop.' I said, 'That will do me fine. I'll be happy to do that.' We walked down Menlove Avenue, and I turned off to go up Vale Road where I lived. I must have been about 15 yards up the road when I heard a car skidding. I turned around to see John's mom going through the air. I rushed over, but she had been killed instantly. Nigel ran back to the house to get Mimi, and she came outside and just sobbed hysterically while they waited for an ambulance." Julia's husband, John Dykins, took John Lennon in a taxi, and they went to the hospital to go meet her there. When they got to the hospital, John was unable to look at his mother's body. At the funeral, he was absolutely devastated. Throughout the service, he laid with his head on his aunt's lap, just seeming completely oblivious to everything. His half-sister Julia would later say in her book, "It was many years before he could bring himself to talk about that night. What he finally said was, 'An hour or so after it happened, a copper came to the door to let us know about the accident. It was awful, like some dreadful film where they ask you if you are the victim's son and all that. Well, I was, and I can tell you, it was absolutely the worst night of my entire life.'" John's mother, Julia, was only 44 years old. A post-mortem examination revealed that she had died of massive brain injuries caused by skull fractures. The coroner said that Mrs. Lennon did not appear to look either way before she walked into the road. I don't know how they can even tell that, but if that's something that can be verified, can somebody explain that to me? Because I would love to know. But whether or not she looked both ways before crossing the street, things were a little bit more complicated than that. Eric, the driver, was off-duty, and he was a learner driver, like a student driver. So he should not have been driving the car alone. He was later reprimanded by his superiors and suspended from duty for a short time. What I want to know is why he was driving in the car, if he really was, going against the rules, or if one of his bosses made him go drive and refused to accompany him. Anyway, there was an inquest held a month later, and they recorded a verdict of death by misadventure. Eric Clegg was acquitted of all charges. He never tried to contact Lennon's family to apologize or anything afterwards. He basically said that he didn't think it would help and it would just make things more difficult. When the Beatles became famous in 1964, it didn't take him very long to realize that the person who he had killed was the mother of John Lennon. It wasn't long before he decided to leave the police force and he took a job as a postman. Ironically, he ended up having to deliver fan mail to Paul McCartney's house. So he was still reminded every day of what he had done. It took him decades to come forward and reveal his identity as the person who had killed Julia Lennon. And therefore inspired quite a few works by John Lennon. Songs like Julia, Mother, and My Mummy's Dead. He even named his first son Julian after her. John was quoted as saying, "I lost her when I was a child of 5 and then again at 17. It made me very bitter inside. I had just begun to reestablish a relationship with her when she was killed. We'd caught up on so much in just a few short years. We could communicate. We got on." Chris Wally, who was the former band manager of the Quarrymen, he stated that John even tried to contact his mother through a seance after she died. John Lennon married his first wife, Cynthia Powell, in 1962 when she became pregnant with their son, Julian. They had met at the Liverpool College of Arts in 1957. John was reportedly a jealous guy by nature and eventually grew kind of possessive and angry, which in turn terrified Cynthia. She wrote a memoir called John, and in it she recalled that one time when they were dating, he struck her after he saw her dancing with Stuart Sutcliffe. She then ended the relationship until 3 months later when he apologized and asked her to come back. She took him back, and she actually noted that he was never again physically abusive. However, he was still very verbally and psychologically abusive. John later said that it wasn't until he met Yoko Ono that he actually started to question his chauvinistic attitude towards women. He said that the Beatles song Getting Better actually told his own story. He said, "I used to be cruel to my woman, and physically, any woman. I was a hitter. I couldn't express myself and I hit. I fought men and I hit women. That is why I'm always on about peace." His marriage began just as Beatlemania was taking off across the UK. The Beatles' band manager, Brian Epstein, actually asked John to keep his marriage a secret because he was worried that fans wouldn't like it. So the Beatles really became whole when Ringo joined the band in 1962. Their first single, Love Me Do, was released in October 1962 and reached number 17 on the British charts. They recorded their debut album, Please Please Me, in under 10 hours on February 11th, 1963, while John was actually suffering from a cold. And you can actually hear it if you listen to the last song recorded on that day, Twist and Shout. John and Paul started their songwriting partnership, Lennon-McCartney. John had said about that period, "We were just writing songs, pop songs with no more thought to them than that, to create a sound, and the words were almost irrelevant." In an interview in 1987, Paul had said that he and the other Beatles idolized John. He said, "He was like our own little Elvis. We all looked up to John. He was older and he was very much the leader. He was the quickest wit and the smartest." John, along with the other band members, were introduced to a drug called Preludin while they were touring in Hamburg. They would often take the drug as a stimulant during their long overnight performances. John started to become concerned about this whole Beatlemania thing and the fact that the fans who were attending the concerts were screaming so loud that you couldn't even hear the music. So he started to worry that the band's musicianship would suffer, that nobody was really listening to the music and the meaning of it, which was important. When they released the song Help, John said, "I meant it. It was me singing Help." In March of 1965, John and George Harrison and their wives attended a dinner party, and apparently the guy who was hosting the dinner party, he spiked all of their coffees with LSD. This was apparently their first time trying LSD. I'm not positive about this, but have any of you guys seen Across the Universe? There's the song I Am the Walrus where they all go to a party and the punch was spiked, and then it's pretty evident that they're tripping out at this party. Anyway, I don't know if that's the connection, but it sounds like it. So anyway, the host of the party didn't actually tell them what they had taken until they were getting ready to leave. And he was like, "I strongly advise you not to leave this house because of the effects that you're going to get pretty soon." Later on, they went to a nightclub and John said that they all thought it was on fire. They were actually screaming, thinking that they were on fire. In March 1966, John Lennon made a really controversial statement. He said, "Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity." That comment greatly offended people, particularly in the United States. People started burning Beatles records and shit, making threats against John Lennon, and supposedly this was one of the reasons that they stopped touring. In the mid-60s, John's use of LSD had increased a lot, and the themes of the Beatles songs were now way more psychedelic and deep than their earlier songs. The years 1966 to 1970 were known as the studio years. From late May to mid-October 1968, the group recorded what is now known as the White Album. Reportedly, it was during this time that tension started to build among the band members. The Beatles ended up traveling to the Maharishi's ashram in India for further guidance. A policeman didn't recognize Cynthia, so he stopped her from boarding. So John's wife had to stay behind, and she later recalled how this incident seemed to symbolize the end of their marriage. During the group's first trip to India in early 1968, John made up the song Dear Prudence. It was actually inspired by Mia Farrow's sister, Prudence Farrow. Prudence had become obsessed with meditating, and apparently she had locked herself in a closet. John and George Harrison tried to coax her out of the closet, which led to John making up the lyrics, singing her to come out and play. Ringo Starr had left the band for a couple weeks, reportedly due to some disagreements with the band, so they ended up recording Back in the USSR and Dear Prudence as a trio without Ringo, and Paul McCartney actually filled in on the drums. John was starting to lose interest in collaborating with Paul McCartney at this point. Not to mention that Yoko Ono was also starting to come around at this time. And Brian Epstein died in 1967, so when that happened, there were a lot more disagreements about who was going to be their financial advisor and shit like that. John and Yoko actually met in 1966. He was invited by a mutual friend to go see her art show, and John and Yoko ended up continuing to write to each other for months afterwards. Yoko admitted that she was really attracted to John, and she sent him a ton of postcards. Months later, John and Yoko collaborated on the Two Virgins sound collage, and they became lovers. So yeah, John was still married to Cynthia, and she was away on vacation in Greece. She came home, and she walked in the house and found John sitting on the floor with Yoko wearing her bathrobe, and they were just drinking tea, and John just looked at her and said, "Oh, hi." Cynthia, shocked and humiliated, left and went to stay with friends. In her book, she had stated, "I was in shock. It was clear that they had arranged for me to find them like that, and the cruelty of John's betrayal was hard to absorb. I felt utterly humiliated and longed to disappear. Their intimacy had been so powerful that I had felt like a stranger in my own home." A few weeks later, Cynthia was informed that John was seeking a divorce and full custody of Julian. She received a letter saying that John was doing so on the grounds of her adultery. He accused her of having a relationship with an Italian guy named Roberto Bassanini, an accusation which she denied. She wrote, "It was laughable. Roberto had been kind and a good friend, but I had never been unfaithful to John. It was his attempt to make himself feel better about what he was doing." After some negotiations, they came to an agreement. They got a divorce, and John gave her £100,000, along with a small annual payment, and he allowed her to keep custody of Julian. Fun fact about Julian. When he was about 4 or 5 years old, he came home from school and he showed his dad a watercolor painting that he had made. He said it was just a painting of a bunch of stars and a little blonde girl that he knew from school. And John said, "What's this?" And he said, "It's Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds." John Lennon used that as inspiration for the Beatles song. A lot of people think that that song is about LSD and that Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is supposed to be, LSD. But John Lennon insists that it is not a song about acid. John and Yoko became inseparable throughout the later days of the Beatles. John had said, "That old gang of mine, that's all over. When I met Yoko is when you meet your first woman and you leave the guys at the bar and you don't go play football anymore and you don't go play snooker and billiards. You know the song, 'Those Wedding Bells Are Breaking Up That Old Gang of Mine'? The old gang of mine was over the moment I met her. I didn't consciously know it at the time, but that's what was going on. As soon as I met her, that was the end of the boys. But it so happened that the boys were well known and weren't just the local guys at the bar." John and Yoko got married in 1969. On April 22nd, 1969, John changed his name, adding Ono as his middle name. So his official name was now John Winston Ono Lennon. John Lennon left the Beatles in September of 1969, but he agreed not to inform the media while the group renegotiated their recording contract. Paul McCartney ended up announcing his own departure while releasing his debut solo album in April 1970. This outraged John. His reaction was, "Jesus Christ, he gets all the credit for it. I started the band, I disbanded it, it's as simple as that." He also said, "I was a fool not to do what Paul did, which was to use it to sell a record." John also claimed that he, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr all got fed up with being sidemen for Paul. After Brian Epstein died, we collapsed, Paul took over and supposedly led us. But what is leading us when we went round in circles? That same year, John and Yoko formed the Plastic Ono Band, releasing Live Peace in Toronto 1969. Between 69 and 70, John released the singles Give Peace a Chance and Cold Turkey, which documented his withdrawal symptoms after he became addicted to heroin. And they also released the single Instant Karma. In the early 70s, the Nixon administration tried to deport John Lennon a bunch of times. See, John and Yoko were like public figures, and they were openly speaking about peace and against war. And the government was worried about how John would influence young voters. John spent years trying to sort out these legalities, but after Nixon left office, things kind of let up on him. In the early 70s, John and Yoko's relationship would start to suffer a little bit. It's been said that John was really, really needy, and sometimes Yoko wasn't so much as a partner as she kind of was his caretaker. It's said that Yoko wanted to hook up with somebody else and kind of suggested taking a break from John, a sort of separation, but she decided to give him a going-away present first, a new girlfriend. So she mentioned May Pang. May Pang was a personal assistant of John and Yoko's. Yoko approached her and suggested that she should begin a physical relationship with John, telling her, "He likes you a lot." She explained that they were kind of going through a separation and they had been arguing and growing apart, and that they agreed that John would start seeing other women, and he was indeed sexually attracted to her. Pang was like, "I could never start a relationship with my boss, and he's married." Yoko just kept pushing and said that she would take care of everything. And Yoko's confirmed this in interviews. May was pretty shocked by the proposition, but she agreed to go out with John. The two were headed to Los Angeles for a weekend, which ended up becoming an 18-month period that they would later call the Lost Weekend. They went to Los Angeles, and while they were there, May encouraged John to reach out to his son Julian, who he hadn't seen for 2 years. John and Julian's relationship was obviously strained at this point. Reportedly, Julian was actually closer to Paul McCartney than he was to his own father. The song Hey Jude was actually Hey Jules originally. He wrote it for Julian during John and Cynthia's divorce to kind of try to comfort him. So John ended up visiting Julian and Cynthia, and they all went to Disneyland. After that, John and Julian started to see each other a bit more regularly. He also would buy his son a guitar and encourage him in his interest in music. John would later go on and have a child with Yoko, another son they named Sean. People like to say that Sean was like the favorite child. He was the child that John Lennon chose to love. In his own words, John says, "Sean is a planned child, and therein lies the difference. I don't love Julian any less as a child. He's still my son, whether he came from a bottle of whiskey or because they didn't have pills in those days. He's here, he belongs to me, and he always will." After John died, it was revealed that he had left Julian very little in his will. While John and May were in Los Angeles, John also rekindled some friendships with Ringo Starr, Paul McCartney, Harry Nilsson, and a few other people. While John was hanging out and drinking with Harry Nilsson, he apparently misunderstood something that Pang had said, and he tried to strangle her. He only relented after Nilsson came over and physically restrained him. John and May went back to their penthouse apartment in Manhattan in June 1974. They also arranged a bedroom for Julian to sleep in when he went to visit them. By December, John and May had started to consider buying a house, and John stopped taking Yoko's phone calls. In January 1975, he agreed to meet up with Yoko, who claimed to have found a cure for smoking. So he went and met up with Yoko, and then afterwards, he failed to come home to May. He didn't call her or anything, he just cut her off and stopped talking to her. So May called the next day, and Yoko told her that John was unavailable because he was exhausted after a hypnotherapy session. 2 days later, John appeared at a joint dental appointment. According to May, he was completely stupefied and confused to such an extent that she thought that he had been brainwashed. John told her that he and Yoko were back together, and he didn't want to see her anymore. May quietly met up with John a few times over the years, but they never got back together. In an interview, John was asked about his time with May, and he said, "You know, I may have been the happiest I've ever been. I love this woman. I made some beautiful music, and I got so fucked up with booze and shit and whatever." So John and Yoko were back together, and they decided to try to have a baby. They had tried to get pregnant in the past, and unfortunately they suffered multiple miscarriages. But this time, when she did get pregnant again, initially she said that she wanted to have an abortion, but she changed her mind and she allowed the pregnancy to continue on the condition that John adopt the role of house husband, which he agreed to do. John continued as a solo artist until about 1975 when their son Sean was born. John then took a break from music and he became a stay-at-home dad as he promised. During this break in his career, he created several series of drawings and he drafted a book containing a mix of autobiographical material and what he termed mad stuff. All of this work would be published after his death. In June of 1980, John Lennon chartered a 43-foot sailboat and embarked on a sailing trip to Bermuda. On the way, he and the crew encountered a storm, rendering everyone on board seasick except for John, who took control and sailed the boat through the storm. This experience reinvigorated him and gave him a new creative spark, a new muse. He spent 3 weeks in Bermuda just writing and refining the tracks for the upcoming album. John came out from hiding in October 1980 when he released the single, Just Like Starting Over. In November, he and Yoko released the album Double Fantasy, which included some of the songs that John had written in Bermuda. It's crazy that he took control of this ship during a storm only to be murdered like a couple months later. Like, how do you survive that? So, that brings us to December of 1980, the death of John Lennon. And this is where I'm going to end this episode. Here's the thing. In order to talk about John Lennon's death, we need to talk about John Lennon's killer, Mark David Chapman. So, for more insight into this, I'm actually reading the book Let Me Take You Down Inside the Mind of Mark David Chapman, the Man Who Killed John Lennon. It's by Jack Jones. This book is based on more than 200 hours of interviews with Mark David Chapman and supported by interviews with his wife, former friends, therapists, with his permission, of course, and other people who he's confided in. With that said, I will come back here in a couple of days and tell you what I found out about Mark David Chapman and give you more of the details into John Lennon's death.
Witnesses told police Lennon was shot near the door to his apartment building as he and Yoko Ono returned from a recording studio. At the hospital where Lennon was taken, young people prayed.
He's not dead. John Lennon can't be dead.
Mark Chapman, charged with the murder of John Lennon, will be arraigned later this morning.
All right, thank you guys so much for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please tell your friends. Leave me a positive review on Apple Podcasts or on brokenlimelight.com. Don't forget, you can also read my sources on brokenlimelight.com, as well as see pictures, videos of interviews. I also have some pretty great merch. Just go check it out. It's fun. You might find out what the next episode to come is. Who knows? I don't know. Okay, well, I appreciate you so much. Don't forget to come back for part 2. Until next time, bye-bye. Have you ever thought about starting a podcast but don't know where to start? Let me help you out. Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. It has everything you need to record, distribute, and monetize your podcast, and it's also free. Anchor has creation tools which allow you to record or edit either on your computer or directly from your phone. Once you have your episodes recorded, Anchor will take care of distributing it to platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and a ton of others. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Today's episode is brought to you by Hunt a Killer. Hunt a Killer is a monthly mystery subscription box that's truly one of a kind. It's basically like a true crime case in a box. It comes with case files, codes to decipher, detailed backgrounds about the suspects and the victims. There's evidence for you to evaluate. It tells an immersive story of a whole crime case from beginning to end. It's kind of like an escape room in a box. You can do this by yourself, or you can team up with a buddy, or you can do it for like a game night or even a date night. You can take a little break from technology and immerse yourself fully into this box, or if you prefer to be a more high-tech investigator, you can join online communities and talk to other Hunt a Killer players about clues and stuff. Hunt a Killer also shares part of the proceeds to the Cold Case Foundation, so your purchase actually helps with real-life cold cases. The best news is that Broken Limelight listeners get 20% off of their first subscription box. So go get started now at huntakiller.com, and don't forget to use the code BrokenLimelight to get your 20% off. That's Broken Limelight, all one word. I'm Dee Dee West, and this is Broken Limelight. Today's episode is going to be a fucking doozy. This episode is going to be about Mark David Chapman, the man who killed John Lennon. If you didn't listen to episode 1, that episode is about John Lennon and his life. So if you want to learn more about that, go back and listen to it, because his life was a lot more interesting than I had realized. So like I said, this episode is going to go into the murder of John Lennon, and we're going to do a deep dive into the mind of the man who killed him. Before I get too far into this, I do need to give a big trigger warning. This episode contains graphic details of not only stalking and murder, but it also has a lot of graphic descriptions of suicidal thoughts and actions, as well as psychosis with auditory and visual hallucinations or delusions. For my sources for this episode, I read quite a few news articles and things like that, as well as the books that I mentioned in part 1. I watched a few interviews too, because, man, this guy, Mark David Chapman, just loves to talk about himself. But the main source for this episode is the book Let Me Take You Down Inside the Mind of Mark David Chapman, the Man Who Killed John Lennon by Jack Jones. The book is exactly what it sounds like. It's diving inside the mind of this man, which is absolute chaos. The book is based on more than 200 hours of interviews with Mark David Chapman, as well as interviews with his friends, his wife, people who worked with him, and, therapists and professionals, things like that. With that said, a lot of what we know about Chapman is from his own account, and the guy is known to live in his own little fantasy world. Like, he's a pathological liar, but he also truly lives, in his own little made-up world. And a lot of times when he speaks, he sounds like he's writing a book, like he's very dramatic and just, a storyteller. Well, this is going to be a long fucking ride, so let's get right into it. Mark David Chapman was born in Fort Worth, Texas on May 10th, 1955. His parents were named David and Diane Chapman. Mark weighed almost 12 pounds at birth. His mother, Diane, was panicked that something was wrong with him because she knew back then that nurses would lie and try to keep a straight face if there was something wrong with the baby, just to avoid upsetting the mothers. So she insisted on seeing him before they even finished cleaning him up. So they eventually brought her the baby, and she saw that he was fine. He was just, a chubby little baby. Mark's mother, Diane, was a really sweet and whimsical woman. She doted on Mark, and she always told him he was a good boy, he was very well behaved, and he rarely cried. He did have a habit of rocking back and forth when he was a baby, to the point that he would actually rock his crib across the room. Diane became worried and she took him to a doctor, but they told her that it wasn't anything to worry about and that he would eventually grow out of it. He never did grow out of it. At least as of this book, which came out in 1992, he had said, "To this day, I still rock back and forth sometimes." Mark remembers his mother as a very extroverted and expressive woman. She made very little effort to hide or stifle her emotions and her thoughts from Mark. Like, she would cry during movies in front of Mark and never shied away from showing those feelings, and she would be the one to answer difficult questions for him, like, why was I born, or what am I supposed to be? She would encourage him to explore his thoughts and his feelings and to use his imagination. She was a free spirit and very creative and imaginative. Diane always told Mark that he was brilliant and special and that he was destined for greatness. She totally inspired him and made him believe that he could be a brilliant writer or anything he wanted to be. The only problem was, while Diane and Mark were living in this world of whimsy, she never taught Mark about the real world or how he would have to work hard to achieve these dreams. As an adult, he kind of just expected things to be handed to him in life. Mark's father, David Chapman, was a total contrast to Diane. He was a staff sergeant in the Air Force, and he was discharged shortly after Mark's birth. Then he moved to Indiana to be with Diane and Mark, and he decided to pursue a new career and a new education with the new GI Bill for military veterans, and he got a job working for the American Oil Company. Diane actually worked as a part-time nurse for a while to help put him through college. Mark describes his father as emotionally distant and abusive. One of Mark's most vivid childhood memories is of his family having Thanksgiving dinner, and everything was all set up, and Mark and his sister and their mom, Diane, were all waiting for David to come down to the table. David then came down the stairs, muttering to himself, and he went to the table and grabbed this steaming turkey with his bare hands and just slammed it onto the table. He never explained himself or apologized or ever acknowledged that he had done that. On another occasion, he supposedly pushed Mark's face into a plate of spaghetti. David also abused Diane. Mark recalled seeing his mother running through the house and running through his bedroom with her clothing all messed up, just trying to escape David. Sometimes Mark would wake up in the morning and his mom would be in the bed with him and she would be completely battered. When Mark was about 10 years old, Diane started crying out his name for him to help fend off David's advances. Mark had to physically place his body between his mother and his father and even threatened his father. Diane has admitted that she wasn't much like a mom to Mark as much as she was more like his best friend. Psychologist Alice Hoagland said that male children thrust into the role of surrogate spouse and protector of their mothers often grow up with incredibly grandiose ideas about themselves, and that the child at an early age learns the bizarre message that he's so powerful he can take care of the most powerful person in the world, his mother. The family eventually decided to move to the south, to Decatur, Georgia. Mark recalls having little pockets of inexplicable and violent impulses that he had no control over. He says he felt like a normal kid in his early years, and then suddenly he started to get these occurrences, mostly in school or when he tried to interact with other kids. He just didn't fit in, and other kids teased him, and he felt alienated and didn't know how to defend himself. One day at school, a bigger kid gave him an atomic wedgie, and he did this on the playground in front of like 20 or 30 other kids. Not only was this painful and embarrassing, but Mark also had a brown stain on his underwear, so everybody laughed at him and started talking about him, saying that he had shit his pants. Mark never got over this. He defines this as like one of the big moments of his life that defined him as a loser. Eventually, Mark tried to be the bully at school to kids who were smaller than him, but it ended up backfiring on him. One time he decided to fuck with a kid named Artie, and Artie was playing with the ball and Mark kicked it away, and Artie was like, "Look, stop doing that." And Mark didn't stop. So Artie decked him in the face 4 or 5 times. Mark said that he punched back, but only punching Artie's arms. He could never bring himself to hit anybody in the face. He said, "This was a fight I picked, and it set a tone for me. For the rest of my life, I would always back down from a confrontation. It made me feel scared inside. It made me a coward. Even years later, when I killed a man, I had to shoot him in the back." There was another guy at school named Neil who would physically bully Mark, so Mark got this idea that he would learn karate. So he called up this karate place and he left a message on their answering machine. The next day, Neil went up to him at school and he had known all about Mark calling them. As it turned out, Neil was actually at that karate studio in a karate class when Mark called and left the message. When Mark was about 10, not only was Diane turning to him for protection from her husband, but she was also turning to him more and more to express her feelings. She told him about how she hated his father and she only married him so that she could have a baby, and she told him that she was worried she was becoming unattractive and that maybe her husband was having an affair. She would also tell Mark that she might commit suicide by the time she turns 50. So from an early age, Mark kind of had this responsibility to take care of his mom, and he had little support to deal with his own troubles. He was feeling like an outsider at school and among his peers, so he ended up turning to his own imagination to deal with his problems. This is when he created the Little People. The Little People were a make-believe society that lived inside of Mark's walls. They worshiped Mark. He would summon them from the walls to make them work in the stores and the communities that he would envision. He would make them dance for him, and whenever he was angry, like if kids at school were fucking with him or if he was mad at his dad, he would get revenge by murdering the Little People. He had a little button on the arm of his couch that when he pushed it, he would imagine all the houses where the Little People lived blowing up. So he would like push this button and like make these little war sounds like pew, 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 and just like murder all the little people. And then after he calmed down, he would apologize and they would always forgive him. When the little people pleased him, he would reward them with music from his favorite band, the Beatles. Mark used to play them the album Meet the Beatles, which was the only album that he owned. He had built a little cardboard stage and used action figures or like little army men to make little Beatle characters to play with. He used to sit and stare at the album cover and just observe the faces of all of the Beatles. There was something about one of the guys that he didn't like. It was John Lennon. He said it was his lips. He had thin lips he didn't like. Sometimes Mark would sit on the floor of his bedroom for hours just listening to this album and rocking back and forth in front of the little stage and like reciting the lyrics of the songs and then applauding at the end of each song. He would beam the music signals into a pretend sound system in his brain so that he could broadcast the music into the homes and the shops of the little people. Mark says he doesn't know exactly what age the little people showed up, but he feels as though they were always with him and they knew everything about him and had been everywhere he had been. At first they were invisible, and then one day he saw them going in and out of their homes, and he thought it was really odd that nobody else could see them. The first day that he saw them came after a restless night. He was having a hard time sleeping because he could hear his parents fighting and his mom crying out in her bedroom. He also had gone to bed with a fever and a bad cold that night. Also, he had just seen a movie called Toby Tyler, which was about an orphan boy who ran away from his cruel uncle to join the circus. Mark's parents had remarked to him that he looked like Toby Tyler and that he was handsome just like Toby Tyler. And one time, Mark's father took him to a Toby Tyler circus. And when Mark got home, he went back to his room and lost himself in imaginary adventures for several days. In his mind, the little people somehow had to be connected to Toby Tyler. So the morning that Mark first saw the little people, he was sitting in his room trying not to think about his mom crying the night before. So he was sitting on the edge of his bed with his head lowered, and he was beaming the Beatles music to his little Beatles toys. He was rocking side to side, and he looked straight ahead, looking closely at the walls, and he finally just saw the little people picking up his signals. They started singing along and smiling and rocking their bodies with Mark. And they would cheer and they would chant, "Mark the King of Music, Mark the King of the Little People, long live the King of the Little People." So now Mark's looking at his walls and he can see like an entire city. They had these big screens that were broadcasting Mark, and Mark starts to address them saying, "Listen, remember what I've been telling you guys about my parents? Well, it's happening again, and you guys have to make my dad stop hurting my mom." Later on, Mark heard his dad's car start and leave the driveway, and he noticed that he was home alone. He went to the den and put on a Beatles record. He started rocking furiously and summoned the little people down to his den, and when they started showing up through the walls, he slowed his rocking to the beat of the music. He was listening to the song Little Child by the Beatles, and he changed the words and sang, "Little people, won't you play with me? Little people, you must stay with me." As the song ended, he laughed out loud at the new lyrics he had made up. He stared back into the walls, and suddenly he thought about his parents again. Without any warning, he rapidly started moving his fingers like he was pressing imaginary buttons on the arm of the couch, and then he started making his little kid war sounds like the shooting and explosions again, the pew, 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 pew. The little people inside the walls started screaming and falling to the streets. Buildings tumbled as they screamed for help under the rubble, and he said, "I'm sorry, but that's what happens when I get angry." A few years later, he had forgotten about the little people, and then he discovered masturbation. See, Mark didn't know anything about sex. He didn't even think about it until he was about 13, and he saw something on TV about it, or he saw it happening on TV. So he asked a friend about it, and his friend explained sex to him for the very first time. Mark was shocked and appalled. His parents had always slept in separate rooms, and he just couldn't believe what they did in order to have him. especially since his mom had told him that she didn't even like her husband and she only stayed with him to have a baby. Mark thought the whole idea of sex was just really dirty. His friend also told him that if he put his hand in his pants and rubbed himself, it would feel good. Several months later, he was watching a movie with Doris Day in it, and he remembered what his friend told him. There was something about Doris Day that aroused him for the first time in his life, but he didn't know what to expect, so he was really surprised and frightened when he ejaculated. It freaked him out, and he fought the urge to run to his mama. He actually thought that he had injured himself. After he discovered masturbation, he would masturbate up to 7 times a day. He would fantasize about older, mature women, like women from TV or church or something, or sometimes it would be like teachers. But he never felt that sense of arousal with girls his own age. Mark would sometimes have fantasies of all these women that he thought about being lined up, like chained up in a secret dungeon of the basement of his school. In his fantasies, he almost never had sex with these women. He just made them touch him and give him oral sex. His mom would make comments about his masturbation that really made him uncomfortable. Like, she would grab his underwear from his hamper and dangle it and say, "I know what you're doing up there in your room." And that made Mark feel really exposed and violated. When Mark was 14 years old, he discovered psychedelic drugs. The Beatles had really shifted in style by then. They were really like an entirely different band. So by this point, the Magic Mystery Tour album had come out, and the Beatles now had long hair and were into meditation and drugs. Mark gave himself the nickname Mark the Freak. This was like a new druggy persona he gave himself, but along with it, he felt like he finally belonged with a group of people. In fall of 1969, Mark was a freshman in high school. Everybody noticed the change in Mark at this point. He went from being a clean-cut nerd to this mysterious hippie, Mark the Freak. Diane says that this was the year that Mark had become, quote, a stranger in his own home, an alien creature she and her husband could no longer either control or understand. She says that she grew to fear her son, and she believed that he held a mysterious power over them. Mark was one of those guys that would get high on marijuana and LSD, but he would also pretty much get high on whatever he could possibly find to get high on. Like, he would sniff glue and lighter fluid on his way to school in the morning. He would do small doses of acid in between classes. One night, he snuck out in the middle of the night and he went and did acid with a bunch of his friends in somebody's basement. When everybody went to sleep, Mark found himself unable to go to sleep, and he noticed that there was a knife in the room. All of a sudden, he felt the urge to pick it up and murder everybody in their sleep. He didn't end up killing anybody that night, but this was the first sign to Mark of how bad his rage was. On another occasion, Mark got into a confrontation with his father, and he grabbed a knife that was nearby and went after him, but his father was able to grab his arm and twist it backwards until he dropped the knife and was just like, okay, it's cool, man, it's cool. Mark was using a lot of LSD by this time. In 1970, he ran away to join the circus. He planned this elaborately. He kept it a secret and was really mysterious about his whereabouts, even with his classmates, so that his parents wouldn't know where to find him. Mark said he couldn't explain it, he just had to leave his house. So Mark came up with the plan to move to Miami, but he told all his friends that he was actually going to California. He started saving his lunch money and setting aside clothes for this trip. Weeks before his trip, he called a taxi company and arranged for them to pick him up from a movie theater and take him to the airport. So he had his mom take him to the movies, and he told her that he was meeting up with friends, and then he snuck out through a rear exit and took a cab to the airport. He bought a one-way ticket to Miami, and then he went back to the cab driver and had him take him back to the movie theater. And then he made plans with his cab driver to pick him up in 2 weeks at a diner at 5 a.m. And this cab driver did it. He took this 14-year-old kid back and forth to the airport and didn't even question it. So anyway, the flight was 2 weeks later. Mark woke up before 3 in the morning and put on a disguise, which was like a hat and sunglasses, and he walked out of his front door with the suitcase. He walked to the diner just totally anxious, thinking that a policeman or somebody was going to stop him. I mean, he was actually kind of doubtful that the cab driver was even going to be there. When he got to the diner, he bought himself a cup of coffee, which was actually his first cup of coffee ever. This moment felt like the beginning of adulthood to Mark. He had gone to the airport in nicer clothes, trying to look less like a sloppy hippie, just so that he would blend in a little more. When his plane landed in Miami, he went to the bathroom and he put his hippie clothes back on, bell-bottoms, a leather jacket, sandals, and he dumped his hat and glasses into a trash can. He left the terminal and he walked up to a cab driver and said, "Take me where the freaks are." Sure you did, Mark. Mark didn't know a single soul in Miami, and he had no idea where this cab driver was taking him. He had $30 in his pocket, but he supposedly had a sense that he would be able to find food and shelter once he ran into some other freaks, and they would recognize him as one of their own and accept him into their little tribe. The driver dropped him off at the beach, and he started walking along, looking at the faces of others passing by. He studied their behavior and listened to their conversations, just hoping that somebody would stand out, somebody who seemed to be a freak like him. He walked around for like an hour before he finally sat down. He stared off into the ocean, feeling overwhelmingly lonely. He had planned everything out and didn't consider that he would end up alone like this. So he sat there and he meditated for a while, and then he started eavesdropping on this conversation of 2 young men and a girl who were sitting nearby. They were a little bit older than him, like 18, 19. He started inching closer and closer to them before he tried to strike up a conversation, and he asked them if he could join them. So then they offered him a beer, which he had never drank before. He had literally just had his first coffee like 12 hours ago. So he drank the beer and he hung out with them, and he ended up passing out on their beach blanket, and when he woke up, he saw a couple of teenage guys chatting nearby, and he realized that he was now among the freaks. So he tagged along with these hippies for 4 days. They taught him how to shoplift and how to panhandle, and they would all sleep in these concrete sewer pipes at the construction sites near the beach. The only reason that they let Mark tag along was because Mark had a little bit of money. Once it ran out, they started to get tired of him. And because he was so young, he started catching the attention of police officers. So they dumped him. But they told him that they were going to get money and get to the Miami Pop Festival, and they would meet him there. Mark walked around for a while, sticking his thumb out, trying to hitchhike. Eventually, he came across a low-budget carnival. By the way, Mark talks a lot about the child in him and the adult in him. The child in him tends to be the excited one and the one who gets emotional, and that's the one who planned Mark's escape. The adult in him is apprehensive and uncertain, but the child in him needs the adult to carry out the plans. When Mark found this carnival, the child in him was ecstatic. The carnival people offered him food and shelter if he would perform menial tasks around the carnival grounds. His first job was as a security guard. He would sleep on cardboard boxes under tables as he was supposed to guard the food. One day he met a guy named Carlos who invited him to stay with him and his family. Carlos's father felt bad for Mark because he was a little kid, so he let him stay with him under the condition that he would work in their appliance rental business. So during the day he would work, and at night he and Carlos would hang out and look for pot. After a while, Carlos's dad was like, "Listen, I know you're a runaway and you can't stay here." So he took him to the bus station and told him to go home to his parents. When he got back home, he was shocked to find out that he had only been gone for 2 weeks. Later that year, Mark's buddy convinced him to go to a religious retreat. Apparently, he told him that there were going to be a lot of girls there. While there, Mark got reacquainted with a girl named Jessica, who was actually in his 2nd grade class. She introduced him to some of her friends who invited Mark to play in a Christian rock band. On this retreat, Mark was deeply affected by a film that was shown about Jesus. When the retreat was over, he went home and got back into his Mark the Freak identity. There was another time where he went to another religious retreat, and he apparently passed out LSD to young Christian kids who had never taken it before. The following summer, he went on vacation in Florida to visit his grandmother. There, he went in search of the freaks again. He found some hippies and druggies to hang out with. He continued to take a lot of drugs, and they started taking a toll on his sanity. He suffered a series of bad trips and flashbacks, and he said he had frightening hallucinations where the world became like a two-dimensional cartoon. One day he was hanging out with all these hippies, and then later on he went to get something out of his wallet, and he noticed that his buddies had ransacked it. Mark felt really low at this point and started crying. By now, Mark was 16 years old, and he decided to turn to Jesus. He stopped dressing like a hippie because he says it just felt right after making this huge turnaround in his life. It was around this time that he would start to voice his intense loathing of John Lennon and the Beatles. He was really angry about the whole thing where John said that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus. Mark also said that the song Imagine was blasphemy and also a communist song. Mark had gone to a party with his religious friends, and he really wanted to play a song that he had written on the guitar, but the party was so busy and noisy that he didn't get the chance. It bummed him out so much, and little by little, he just stopped showing up to the meetings and kind of started losing his focus on religion. So Mark, again, had a void to fill, and he turned to the rock and roll music of Todd Rundgren, who actually had some beef with John Lennon at one point. What happened was, Todd Rundgren called out John Lennon in an interview in 1974 where he called him a hypocrite. Like, for example, he called him out for the way he treats women poorly while singing about peace and love. He went on to suggest that John Lennon was only promoting these views as a way to gain attention. They went back and forth a little bit, just talking shit about each other in interviews. John would intentionally butcher his name and call him Sod Runtelstuntel and Turd Rundgren. Anyway, so Mark became a big fan of Todd Rundgren. More so than he was of the Beatles. Mark truly felt like Todd Rundgren had the greatest influence on him, and he believed that Todd Rundgren was a musical genius. He felt that his music and lyrics provided everything he needed to express his identity. He tried to get everyone to listen to his music and tell them to really feel it, but nobody was ever quite as enthused as Mark was. Mark started working at the YMCA as a counselor when he was a teenager. He was very committed to this role and later became an assistant program director. Everyone who worked with Mark had nothing but good things to say about him. The kids called him Captain Nemo, which I think was also his idea. This was like another persona for him, just like Mark the Freak. But Captain Nemo was from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and this would set the stage for his later role as Catcher in the Rye. So the thing about The Catcher in the Rye was that the title of the book was about Holden Caulfield, the main character of the book, imagining himself as somebody who literally sat at the bottom of a cliff catching children as they fell off. That might not be the best explanation, but I'll get more into the book later. The point is, Mark was already starting to see himself as somebody who needed to save the children. In 1975, Mark was given a chance to travel to Beirut, Lebanon, but he was only there for a few weeks because the country was in the middle of a civil war. So Mark and another volunteer spent their days huddled under furniture while bombs, rockets, and gunfire went off in the streets. Meanwhile, Mark took a little voice recorder and recorded these war sounds. The volunteers were evacuated, and when Mark got back to Georgia, he was visibly shaken up. So then he was moved to Arkansas to work with Vietnamese refugees, where, again, he fully committed himself to his work, and everyone had nothing but good things to say about him. That year, he rekindled his friendship with Jessica, the girl from the Christian retreat who was also in a second grade class. By 1975, the two were engaged. But just a few weeks before that, Mark had actually cheated on her and lost his virginity to another camp counselor at the YMCA. And he felt horrible and sinful for it. He was pretty certain that she was saving herself for marriage, and he started to despise himself. It wasn't long before they broke off their engagement. He committed himself more than ever to his work at the YMCA, kind of hoping to make up for his mistakes. In 1976, Mark was enrolled in community college. At this point in his life, he really started to feel like a nobody. He had just finished these important experiences, like surviving a war zone and working with Vietnamese refugees. And now all of a sudden he's just sitting in community college studying hard just like a normal person like everybody else. But he didn't feel like a normal person. He said, "I wasn't in charge of anything. I wasn't in a foreign country taping bomb sounds down the avenue. I was a regular college student with regular responsibilities and studies, and that was it. That was all. I was just like everybody else, a nobody. And when I had to face that truth, my insides fell in on myself. I fell down a dark hole. So what does a nobody do? A nobody gets a nobody job because he feels like he can't handle anything else." Mark really started to struggle with his sense of identity. He felt like he was constantly searching for this personality that he would never find. Before Mark gave up and got himself a, quote, nobody job, he went back to the YMCA for the summer camp. For a short time, he was back in his element and out of his depression, but then one day he made a comment to another counselor who turned around and snapped at him. This small incident was enough to knock him back into his depression. This is when Mark decided that he was going to go to Hawaii and kill himself. He tried praying, but it wasn't helping, and he was starting to feel like God wasn't there for him. As soon as he got to Hawaii, he was filled with this exhilarating joy of life. His thought was that he wanted to go and spend a week or two in paradise before committing suicide, so he spent like a week just living it up, drinking and partying, and going on boat tours, and he blew all of his money. But he wasn't ready to die yet, so he got a cheap room at the YMCA. While he was at the YMCA, one day he got the idea to call Jessica again, his ex-fiancée. He told her that he was going to kill himself, and Jessica didn't love him anymore, but she was really, really scared that he was going to kill himself, so she told him to come home, and he showed up at her doorstep, and now that he was there, she let him down easy and told him they were not going to get back together. So Mark spent a couple weeks at his parents' house, and then he got together all the money he had, about $1,200, and he decided to go back to Hawaii, but this time not to kill himself, but rather to start a new life there. He was going to get a job and a house and start over. As soon as he landed in Hawaii, he went, "Oh fuck, I'm all alone again, and Hawaii is fucking expensive." So this was 1977. Mark spent his days working temporary, low-income jobs that he would often abandon right after payday. Whenever he had money, he would stay at the YMCA, and when he didn't, he would sleep on the streets. Sometimes he would just hang out in a payphone booth and just chat with the suicide hotline. Mark fell into a dark depression and again started to plan for his suicide. He went and bought a vacuum hose, and he drove to an isolated parking lot, and he jammed one end of the hose into his exhaust pipe, and then he draped the other end across his back seat. He sealed up all the edges of the car, and he closed up all the windows tightly, and when he was ready, he got into the car, and he turned on the ignition. He laid his head back and closed his eyes. But then he woke up. He woke up to the sound of a bird pecking at his window. And then he looked out his window, and there was a guy standing there, kind of asking him if he was okay. He got out of the car, and he looked at the hose, and he saw that it had melted. Because it was plastic. Mark took this as a sign that God wanted him to live. Still, he realized that he needed help at this point, so he checked into a mental health facility. He spent the first few days sleeping, exhausted by his thoughts and emotions from the past month. The notes from his stay at this facility state that he was severely depressed and had no will to continue living. And yet, about a week later, he bounced back. He was said to show no signs of depression. After 2 weeks, he was like a whole new person. He was then discharged, and he came back to the clinic to work as a volunteer. And then his doctor actually supported a decision to hire Mark in their maintenance and public relations departments. It didn't take long before Mark started trying to act like a counselor to the patients. On one occasion, the doctors actually asked Mark to talk to a patient who, like him, had come to Hawaii for a last fling before killing himself. While Mark was still searching for his identity, these doctors really started to take him in and treat him like a peer, and he was starting to feel accepted. He would go out for beers with the doctors and hang out with them and go to dinner. They often had to remind themselves that he was a former patient. One of the counselors noted that he preferred the company of older people, While Mark was only about 22, the other employees in the clinic were all in their 40s. And this counselor theorizes that maybe he was searching for parental figures. Then Mark met Reverend Peter Anderson, and Mark told him all about the depression and his suicide attempt and how he felt like God saved him and now he was letting him down by not fulfilling his purpose. Peter invited him to live with him and his wife, and Mark started avoiding the doctors in the psychiatric unit. They became worried when Mark started to withdraw, and they feared that he was just using religion to mask a much greater pain and darkness inside of him. So the staff at the psychiatric clinic did acknowledge that Mark had all these problems, all this anger and confusion inside of him, but nobody had the slightest clue that he might be schizophrenic. During his sessions, he explained that at an early age, he developed parasitic mirror-like survival skills, where he learned to capture and reflect the character traits of people he wanted to like him. He said, "Even without knowing it, I would reflect people's own personalities back to them. I was almost always charming to people, until I started reflecting back to them the parts they didn't want to see. Then they didn't want me around anymore. Even when I was very young, my mother told me, 'Mark, you don't wear well with people.'" Mark's condition started to improve. He was doing really well at his job, and it made him feel really, really important, like people needed him. His parents and sister went to Hawaii to visit him in 1978, and his father gave him $1,000 as a Christmas gift. Then Mark got the idea to travel to the Far East. His idea grew bigger and bigger as he was influenced by films like Around the World in 80 Days and The Great Race, so he got 6 weeks off of work and decided to travel around the world. This trip also gave him an excuse to see his travel agent, Gloria. Gloria Abe was a petite Asian woman who was about 5 years older than Mark, and Mark would call her up often to make changes to his travel plans. He would read about a new place in a book or a brochure, and then he would call Gloria and have her add it to his itinerary. And then he would send her thank you notes, which eventually turned into teddy bears and roses. He started showing up at her job with coffee and pastries and said, "You can't possibly work this hard for all of your clients." He was right, she didn't. Eventually, Gloria fell in love with Mark. On the day of his flight, she looked up his address and showed up to his house a few hours before the flight. She put a Hawaiian lei around his neck and gave him a warm kiss. Over the next few weeks, he sent her postcards from all over the world. While he was in Tokyo, he spoke with an official from YMCA who asked him about his work with the Vietnamese refugees. It was at this moment that Mark realized that he had become void of compassion. All the love and compassion that he felt for these refugees had escaped him, as if all that feeling had just dried up, and he felt guilty about it. And then his depression came back as he started feeling bad about not going further with his work with the YMCA. In Thailand, Mark had his first encounter with a sex worker. He went for a walk after having dinner and drinking a few beers, and this woman, who was very drunk, supposedly threw her arms around him, trying to make some money. He says that he tried to push her away, but ended up giving in and going with her. In India, he saw the contrast among the poor and the rich, the pain and the desperation that separated the wealthy, quote, phonies from the real people who struggled daily to survive. Mark got back to Hawaii on August 20th, 1978. Gloria was waiting for him at the gate. She ran right into his arms. After that, they were pretty much inseparable. They would go on dates, and when they didn't have a date planned, he would show up at her door with some drinks in him, and he would tell her that he was depressed and needed somebody to talk to. Gloria never turned him away, no matter how drunk he was or how late at night it was. He didn't tell her about his suicidal thoughts or what brought him to Hawaii, but she could sense that he was hurt and he had felt wronged by others. Mark and Gloria got married on June 2nd, 1979. Around this time, Mark's parents announced that they were getting a divorce. Not only that, but his mother, Diane, had decided to move to Hawaii. Gloria recalls that in the early months of their marriage, Mark was really torn between spending his time and his money on his wife or on his mother. Diane would even tag along to dinner dates, cruises, and excursions that Gloria felt she should have been able to enjoy with her husband alone. And she voiced this to Mark, but he would insist that his first duty was to his mom. Gloria admits that she was kind of jealous as Mark was doing his best to get his mom set up in a nice place, and Gloria kind of pressured him to choose between her and his mother. He ended up cutting off contact with his mother. Admittedly, Gloria hated that she had this jealousy inside of her, and she was working on it. She says that she overcame it a few months before Mark would commit the murder. Mark's father, David, had left Diane with no money and no financial resources, so Mark was pissed, and he felt like he had to help his mom. He said that he wanted to kill his father for what he had done to his mother during and after the marriage. He also recalls feeling a parent-like responsibility to care for his mom after she moved to Hawaii. He told psychiatrists that he didn't actually want her there, though. It was his island, not hers, and she interfered. Mark started to get really annoyed with her because she couldn't stop talking about herself and her new life and her new boyfriends. She would have sexual encounters with beach bums and guys who were about Mark's age. So Mark would get mad at her and he would call her menopausal, and then she would get mad as hell. Diane did her usual thing where she would turn to Mark as kind of a confidant instead of acting like his mother. She confided in him that his sister Susan wanted to come visit, but she didn't want her to because she was starting her new life there. And Diane basically moved to Hawaii without a plan. Mark was the one who got her a divorce lawyer and also found her a job and an apartment. Eventually, Gloria made peace with Diane. The three of them would rent a car and they would drive around the island, sometimes stopping for dinner or drinks at an elegant hotel. Their credit card bills started piling up, but Gloria knew better than to question Mark about his spending. Mark says that his lavish spending of money was a way to bolster his self-esteem, which was at an all-time low. He felt ridiculous working as a housekeeper while he was now a married man. He felt like he needed a more important position in life. This is when he became a printer and a public relations representative. This job was prestigious, but it was very demanding, and it started to take a toll on Mark's emotional health. He was no longer able to socialize like he did in his old position, and he didn't feel important anymore. And when Mark was alone, he got really, really lonely. And when Mark had too much time alone, it just gave him more time to think and look back on his faults in life. Mark started noticing that his behavior was becoming more and more aggressive. It was like he would explode on somebody, and then when they would react, he would get terrified. Like one time, he and Gloria were walking up the stairs to their apartment, and there were a couple of guys who were talking loudly, and Mark turned and yelled at them to shut up. And then later on, he felt guilty about it, so he went back and looked for them to apologize, and the guys ignored him. After that, I think a few days had gone by, Gloria and Mark had walked by one of these guys, and the guy whistled at Gloria. Mark became enraged, and he wanted to jump up and grab the guy, but he didn't. He was scared. So, they moved. They broke their lease and they moved to a luxurious condo. One day, Mark went to pick Gloria up from work, and he got mad when she took too long. He laid on his horn and he started yelling at her, and then he went into the office and started yelling at her boss. Then it happened again another time, and Gloria's boss slammed the door in Mark's face. So Mark made Gloria quit her job. Mark's colleagues also started to notice his increasing hostility. He was not satisfied with his job, so he would create programs and new systems for himself and other people around the job to use. He had this perfectionist attitude that would cause him to become enraged when other people did things differently than how he thought they should be done. He was eventually fired after having a confrontation with the nurse who was asking him about a print job that he was taking too long to do. In December of 1969, Mark got a job as a security guard and basically cut off all ties with his friends from the hospital, who basically helped him find the will to live after his suicide attempt. Mark was in pretty bad shape again. He started drinking heavily, and at some point, the little people came back. But now, they had grown up and they were wearing three-piece suits, and they were here to help Mark organize his life and his finances. And instead of a monarchy where Mark was the king, it was now more like a democratic parliament type of thing where Mark was now president. So where he used to be the ruler who could just blow them up willy-nilly, now he had to submit proposals to a board and get their approval before making big decisions. Mark would address the little people on this big screen that came down like a presentation in a boardroom, and he would tell them that they're going to be okay financially. The little people made him feel like he was running a country, and they were the only thing that kept him functioning. Mark became obsessed with artwork, and he started making watercolor paintings. Gloria recalled that his paintings were really good, but Mark could not leave them alone. It's like they were never perfect, and he would always go back and add to it or try to make it better until it was just a big, dark mass of color. Gloria said, "It's like nothing was ever good enough until he destroyed it." In March of 1980, Mark abandoned his obsession for art and traded it for an obsession with finances. He would get up early in the morning or late at night and sit at the table with a pencil and a calculator and just stare off into space for hours. Sometimes even talking as though there was somebody else there with him. Gloria asked him who he was talking to, and he tried to tell her about the little people. He told her about how they were tiny people who lived inside of the walls when he was a kid, but now they were back to help him reorganize his life. Mark's again in really bad shape now, at the lowest of his lows, and talking to the little people and organizing things was the only thing that really kept him going. He shut out everybody around him, and he was so sensitive that he just felt like every single person had let him down or rejected him in some way. He started doing weird things for his own amusement, like calling in bomb threats and making threatening phone calls to his landlord, or like threatening a TV repairman who he didn't like. He had a payphone outside of his apartment, and he would watch it from his window, and whenever somebody was standing near it, he would call it, and when they answered, he would tell them, "I'm watching you. I'm going to follow you and kill you." Sometimes during these phone calls, he would also use a laughing box. A laughing box is this thing that they used during the 70s. It's like a prank thing, like a whoopee cushion or Jack in the Box or something. Let me play it for you. So this is what a laughing box sounds like. So yeah, he would play this sound during his creepy little threatening phone calls. Mark also started spending all of his time at the library with the goal of reading every single book. Eventually he left his job. It was just too hard and too much pressure. He thought that he could stay home with Gloria and just clean up and cook for her. One day, Mark remembered the book The Catcher in the Rye, and he decided to look for it in the library. He had only read it one time before when he was 16, and he's 25 at this point. So he looked for it at the library, but the library didn't have it. He came back week after week after week, and they never got it. So he went and he bought a copy, and he started reading it, and he could not put it down until he got to the last page. And then when he finished it, he started it over, and he read it again. Mark related to the main character, Holden Caulfield, a lot. And Mark tends to do this. He sees synchronicities, and to him, they mean everything. Like, he believes that all these things connect in order to give him some kind of purpose. Catcher in the Rye is about a depressed 17-year-old boy named Holden Caulfield. Holden is like an angsty teenager, and everyone he interacts with, he feels seems to let him down somehow. He calls everybody a phony, and therefore, Mark starts to refer to everybody as a phony. And Holden Caulfield does kind of remind me of Mark, but not in a good way. Not in a way that Mark should be proud of. Like in the book, Holden calls up this girl who he calls the queen of all phonies, and then he invites her to run off with him. Like, if anything, Mark and Holden are the real phonies here. And maybe that's the point, like they're projecting. So Mark went out and he bought 2 new copies of The Catcher in the Rye. One copy he kept for himself, and the other one he gave to Gloria after signing it Holden Caulfield. Mark told Gloria that she should read the book to better understand him, so she did read it. He told her that he was thinking about changing his name to Holden Caulfield. Over that month of October 1980, Gloria noticed that Mark's mood seemed to have improved. He told Gloria and her parents that he was seriously thinking about taking a trip to London, and then this idea evolved, and he said he now wanted to take Gloria and move to England. Then he abandoned that plan altogether and told her, "Sometimes I just get so frustrated and bottled up that I just want to blow somebody's head off." On October 18th, after rereading Catcher in the Rye, Mark was at the library and he just happened to see a book with John Lennon's picture on it. The book was John Lennon, One Day at a Time by Anthony Fawcett. He looked through the book and carefully observed all the photographs. Remember, by this point, it's 1980, and John Lennon was taking a career break. From 1975 to 1980, John was a stay-at-home dad, and he wasn't releasing any music. So this is now 1980, when John had just gone to Bermuda and written a bunch of new songs. So Mark is looking at these photos of John. He's like on the roof of the Dakota, and he's throwing up peace signs. And just like every other book or movie that Mark has ever seen, he got sucked into this book. So he's reading this book and he's looking at the pictures, and he started to become enraged with John. And it wasn't just envy, he says. But the way Mark puts it, John was a successful man who had the world on a chain, and there was Mark, not even a link of that chain. And then he started remembering when he used to listen to the Beatles as a child, back when he was taught that the world was a whimsical place where he thought he could be whatever he dreamt of. He said, "I thought I loved reality, and I didn't want the world to be the way it was." And then something inside of Mark just flipped a switch. His mind went really dark. He wasn't thinking about murder yet, but he was angry, to the point that he would have destroyed the world if he had control over nuclear weapons. Pew, 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 pew. That's what's happening in Mark's brain. He checked out the book and he took it home to his wife, and he starts going through it and showing her all the pictures. And he says, "The decadent bastard, the phony bastard, who had lied to children, who had used his music to mislead a generation of people who desperately needed to believe in love and a world at war that desperately needed to believe in peace." John Lennon sang about imagining no possessions, while really he's got millions of dollars and yachts and estates, and this pissed Mark off. Not long after this, Mark was looking through a newspaper and he saw a picture of John Lennon in the recording studio with an article talking about his new album, Double Fantasy. In this article, apparently John called himself a phony and said that all the concerts and promotional packages and the bed in for peace were just for publicity. So I couldn't find this exact news article unless Mark is just paraphrasing what's in the actual article. So I found one article from November 1980 from the New York Times where John Lennon is promoting Double Fantasy. But I didn't see any quotes where John said anything about being a phony or doing things for publicity or anything like that. But anyway, I'll link that article on brokenlimelight.com in case anybody wants to see it. I just don't know if Mark took this article and paraphrasing what he believes John said. But anyway, whatever article he's talking about, Mark read it and he says that's proof that John Lennon is indeed a phony. By the way, I forgot to tell you about John and Yoko's bed-in for peace. This was shortly after they were married and during the Vietnam War. So John and Yoko stayed at a hotel in Amsterdam and they wanted to promote peace. So what they did was, instead of doing a sit-in, they called it a bed-in. They stayed in their bed in this hotel for 2 weeks. They invited reporters and news crews into their room to publicize it. And they did this a couple of times. They did a few bed-ins. But anyway, Mark says that John somewhere admitted that all of these bed-ins were just publicity stunts. So after Mark read the book about John Lennon, and then he sees this article about Double Fantasy, he then purchased the album Imagine, and this was just another thing to enrage him. John sang about not believing in God and not believing in the Beatles. He only believes in himself and Yoko. Mark describes how all this just made him want to scream, like, who the fuck does this guy think he is? And he just finished reading Catcher in the Rye and still embracing the persona of Holden Caulfield. So he's thinking about how this shitty world and all the phonies have wronged him, and then he comes across this book about John Lennon, who in his mind is now the biggest phony of all. One day, Mark was sitting cross-legged on the floor of his apartment, just staring out the window and holding Catcher in the Rye in his hand. His wife, Gloria, had a few Beatles albums, and Mark started leafing through them, just looking at all the covers. When he got to the Sgt. Pepper album, that's the yellow album with all the Beatles dressed in, colorful marching band uniforms, Mark spotted John Lennon's face with his glasses and his little mustache, and at that moment, he just knew that he was going to kill him. He said to himself, "Wouldn't it be something if I killed John Lennon?" Wouldn't it be something? What I'm gathering from this is that he's seeing a split between the old John Lennon who he knew in his childhood and this new John Lennon who was a father and a meditator. Let me read another quote real quick. Lennon as a Beatle, Lennon as a phony. Just seeing these terrible inconsistencies, mirroring my own inconsistencies and my own pain and my own guilt at not having accomplished anything. This trinity, the catcher, the new Lennon, the old Lennon, it was just kind of pointing out at me, like an arrow, like the sharpened tip of a triangle, pointing at me. And it was almost like I was handed something, that here was a solution, kill John Lennon. Mark envisioned himself as Holden Caulfield doing what Holden wanted to do, but didn't. There's a part in Catcher in the Rye where Holden finds a sex worker who was wearing a green dress, but when she takes her clothes off, he gets nervous because he's a virgin. He pays her, but then she comes back with her pimp, and they beat him up and they take all his money. Holden then fantasizes about shooting the pimp and killing him. So Mark took it a step further and eventually decided to get a gun. Mark was still in a really dark place, but now he felt that he had a purpose and an identity. Mark would continue to listen to the Beatles records while his thoughts swirled around in his brain. He would take off all his clothes and sit in front of the record player naked, wearing only his headphones, and he prayed, "Hear me, Satan. I ask only that you give me the power to kill John Lennon. Give me the power of darkness. Give me the power of death. Let me be a somebody for once in my life. Give me the life of John Lennon." And then he realized he was going to need more. And then he realized he was going to need more than Satan. He needs to make a plan. And so he summoned the little people. Mark told the little people that John Lennon ruined his life and must be stopped. The little people debated and ultimately told Mark, "We have unanimously agreed that this is a very foolish, a very non-productive decision that you have made." See, even his subconscious is like, dude, what the fuck? They told him that if he carries out his plan, it'll cause a lot of pain and grief to a lot of people, including to his wife and to himself. But Mark was like, "I respect your decision, but I'm doing this." The little people then got up from their table, one by one, and disappeared into his mind, leaving Mark alone. Now, while Mark was praying to Satan and having his little board meeting with the little people in the nude, Gloria was sleeping in the next room. At first, Mark would kind of glance over his shoulder, like he was nervous that she was going to catch him. But it's Mark, so he gets all into his moment, and he's like chanting to Satan and shouting Beatles lyrics. So Gloria woke up, and she woke up to the sound of Mark shouting, "Must die! The phony bastard must die!" Gloria was scared. Like, on one hand, she's hoping that it's just Mark screaming. On the other hand, she's like, oh God, I hope that's not Mark. So she's like hiding under a blanket, freaking out, shaking. And she tried to call his name, but she couldn't force her voice over a whisper. According to Gloria, it sounded like the voice was coming from two people at once, and it turned into kind of a chant. "The phony must die," says the catcher in the rye. "The catcher in the rye is coming for you. Don't believe in John Lennon. Imagine John Lennon is dead. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Imagine that it's over." The music stopped, and Mark was silent for a few minutes before he started quietly muttering to himself, "The fool. The goddamn phony fool. He doesn't even realize that he's going to be dead. Just imagine that." One day, Mark saw a television rendition of a short story by Willa Cather called Paul's Case, which was about a guy, Paul, who was an artistic and misunderstood man with a morbid desire for cool things and soft light and fresh flowers. No surprise, Mark related to this character. Paul was also a sociopath who was planning to run off with thousands of dollars that didn't belong to him for a final fling that would end in death in New York City. Paul had a suite at the exclusive Waldorf Astoria Hotel. So what does Mark do? He spends multiple days calling the Waldorf to try to make reservations. He finally got a room for 2 nights at the end of October. On October 23rd, 1980, Mark quit his job as a security guard. He signed out for the last time using the name John Lennon and then crossed it out. He also pasted the name John Lennon over his name tag before he took his uniform off for the last time. On this same day, just a few hours earlier, John Lennon had officially released a new song called Just Like Starting Over, which was supposed to symbolize John Lennon's return to life. I'm going to share another quote from Mark. He said this after the murder about how he was feeling during this time. He said, "There was no esteem. Nothing had meaning or value. There was either manic happiness and joy about something new, or there was tremendous depression and drinking and fighting and anger and isolation and fear about other people. I needed to scream, but I had no mouth." Listen to the background of some of the Beatles songs. That screaming in the background, that's John Lennon. Listen to him scream when he's singing about not having his mother. Just to think, after a person had been through all that he had been through as a child, then to get murdered by somebody like me.
Alright, so I'm actually going to end this episode here. I'm sorry my voice just changed. This is me in the future, a few days after I recorded this episode. And part of the reason it took me so long is, for one, I have a cold, and two, I powered through a whole concert yesterday. But this recording is long as fuck, so I'm actually just taking it and splitting it in two, and I'm going to go ahead and release part 2 right now, and then I'm going to finish editing part 3 and release that as soon as I'm done. Thank you guys so much for your patience. Be back soon with part 3. Bye-bye.
Today's episode is brought to you by Hunt a Killer. Hunt a Killer is a monthly mystery subscription box that's truly one of a kind. It's basically like a true crime case in a box. It comes with case files, codes to decipher, detailed backgrounds about the suspects and the victims. There's evidence for you to evaluate. It tells an immersive story of a whole crime case from beginning to end. It's kind of like an escape room in a box. You can do this by yourself, or you can team up with a buddy, or you can do it for like a game night or even a date night. You can take a little break from technology and immerse yourself fully into this box, or if you prefer to be a more high-tech investigator, you can join online communities and talk to other Hunt a Killer players about clues and stuff. Hunt a Killer also shares part of the proceeds to the Cold Case Foundation, so your purchase actually helps with real-life cold cases. The best news is that Broken Limelight listeners get 20% off of their first subscription box. So go get started now at huntakiller.com, and don't forget to use the code BROKENLIMELIGHT to get your 20% off. That's Broken Limelight, all one word.
Hi guys, I'm Dee Dee West, and this is Broken Limelight. And I have almost no voice left, so do me a favor, just listen to parts 1 and 2 of the John Lennon episode, and I'm gonna get right into part 3. Okay, here we go. Part 3.
On October 27th, Mark went shopping in preparation for his trip while Gloria was at work. His first stop was at J&S Enterprises, where he bought his gun. Ironically, the salesman who sold him the gun was named Mr. Ono. After buying the gun, Mark went to the police station and applied for a gun permit. The application asked if he had ever been hospitalized for mental illness, and he put no, knowing that if they had known the truth, it would delay his plan. He took his gun home and he hid it in a drawer that his wife never checked. The next day, Mark went to lunch with his mother, Diane, and told her that he was going to go to New York to clear his mind and get a fresh start in life. She asked him, "You aren't going to do anything funny there in New York, are you?" He replied, "No, Mom, nothing at all." That night, as he was getting ready for his flight, Gloria was sleeping, but she woke up to him stroking her hair. She kept her eyes shut in case this was a dream, because he was never this sweet and gentle with her, so she didn't want it to end. So she pretended to be asleep, and he told her that he loved her. Even if sometimes the things he did made it seem like he didn't, he really did love her. And then before he left, he whispered, "How can I do this to you?" The next day, October 29th, Mark boarded his plane to New York with close to $5,000 that he had borrowed from Gloria's parents. Gloria noticed that before leaving, Mark returned all of his books to the library except for the one about John Lennon. He actually took this book to New York. But Mark had done so many questionable things at this point that Gloria just stopped asking questions. When Mark got to New York, he spent the first day just wandering around the city. On his second day, he visited the Dakota, and he went back there every day. Remember, the Dakota is like this fancy apartment building where John Lennon is staying. Mark started hanging out there every day and getting all buddy-buddy with the doorman. He made friends with 2 of the doormen in particular. One of them was named Jose, and he's actually the one who would be working at the Dakota on the day that John Lennon would be killed. So Mark would chat them up and tell them that he's a tourist from Hawaii, and he talked to them about rock and roll and politics and stuff. And he would get really irritated when nobody would give him a straight answer about whether John was home. But he was really careful to hide his frustration. He would tell himself, inappropriate response, totally inappropriate response. And he would kind of repeat that to himself as a mantra to avoid exploding and blowing his cover. Since Mark had left Hawaii on October 29th, he didn't call to check in with his wife Gloria until November 4th. He then told her that he had decided to go to Georgia to see his old friend Dana Reeves. But that wasn't the true reason for his impromptu little trip to Georgia. See, Mark had planned ahead and looked into the firearm laws in New York, and he found out that it was illegal to bring a handgun into New York City even though he had a permit. So he decided not to bring ammunition, thinking that if he got caught, he would be in less trouble. The problem was that you can't buy ammunition in New York without a license. So he got on a plane to Georgia and he asked his buddy Dana to pick him up, and he crashed at his place for a couple days. They hung out and they talked, and Mark kind of confided to Dana that his wife was a wonderful woman, but they had their ups and downs, and Mark was actually considering moving back to Georgia if he could get out of his marriage. Mark asked Dana if he could take him to go see his old choir teacher. I think this is another thing that Holden Caulfield did, but he was really disappointed when the choir teacher wasn't excited to see Mark at all. I don't know if Mark was even a choir student. Then Mark tried to get in touch with his old girlfriend, Lynn, who he says was his high school sweetheart, and he also calls her the love of his life. Lynn agreed to meet with him, so he bought her a cheap teddy bear and some roses, and he and Dana waited in Dana's truck for over an hour, and Lynn never showed up. So Mark just threw the bear and the roses on the side of the road. Then Mark asked Dana to grab some of his guns and take him to do some target practice. Mark noted that his aim improved considerably once they were done practicing. He convinced Dana to give him a few bullets for him to take back to New York because it's a scary place and they won't sell him ammunition. Dana gave him some standard bullets, but Mark was like, no, I want something more powerful. So he grabbed 5 hollow point bullets, thinking that they would explode immediately upon entering the body, killing John Lennon instantly. On the plane ride back to New York, Mark noticed a magazine on a rack with John Lennon on it. He thought about the bullets in his suitcase and he smiled. This was another synchronicity. Mark went back to the Dakota day after day, and each time he was told that John was probably traveling in England or Japan or Spain. Mark felt defeated. So on November 11th, he called Gloria and he told her that he was depressed and he was just going to come home. Then he started spouting off about a gun and killing someone. He was like, I was going to kill him, but your love has saved me. She, of course, didn't understand. He was like, you know what I'm talking about, don't you? And she said, no, Mark, I don't know. Mark, please, just come home. He whispered, Gloria, listen, I'm afraid to tell you this, but I've got to. I've got to say it now. John Lennon. I bought a gun in Honolulu, and when I went to Georgia, I got some bullets from Dana. I was going to kill him, but your love has saved me. She's like, what? Who? What? And he said, you probably don't believe me, but I was going to do it. I was going to kill John Lennon, but our paths didn't cross. And she's like, Mark, please come home before something bad happens. Mark came home on November 12th. Gloria was really happy to have him back, but at the same time, she's understandably concerned. Back at their house, he opened up his suitcase and he pulled out the gun and the container with the bullets. He told Gloria to hold it in her hand so she could feel it. He told her it was unloaded so she didn't have to worry. And then he ordered her to point it at the wall and pull the trigger several times. And then he told her to always be respectful of guns, saying, it's not a toy. Don't ever point it at anybody, even if it's not loaded. A couple weeks later, Mark went back to New York City. He arrived on December 6, 1980. And during his time there, he would kind of hop from hotel to YMCA to hotel. On December 7th, he checked into the Sheraton Hotel, which he knew was expensive, but he really liked to eat at the restaurant there and order from their room service. Because it made him feel important, of course. For some reason, he had thrown away his last copy of The Catcher in the Rye, so he decided that he needed to go buy another one. He went to a bookshop and he happened upon a stack of Playboy magazines with a poster above it announcing that the magazine contained an exclusive interview with John Lennon and Yoko Ono, the first in-depth interview they had given in years. He took the magazine and he went back to the Sheraton and sat down at the restaurant. He read through the interview, and when he was done, he flipped to the centerfold of the magazine. So he's in the restaurant looking at naked women in this magazine now, when all of a sudden he thought about The Catcher in the Rye again, about this experience that Holden Caulfield had where he's in a hotel room with the prostitute who wore a green dress. And then suddenly, Mark was overcome with the desire to be alone with a woman. So he went back to his hotel room and he looked up escort companies in the phone book. He called and asked if they had any foreign women. They said yes, and she works for tips, if you know what I mean. He said, "That's good, but there's only one thing that's important. She's got to be quiet. I don't want somebody who's going to talk. If she doesn't talk, I will tip her very well." About an hour later, a woman with a European accent showed up, and she happened to be wearing a green dress. The woman appeared to be nervous. Mark assured her that he wasn't kinky or weird and that he was a clean guy. He also said, "I'm not even all that interested in having sex. I just want to be in the company of a woman tonight. I'm expecting that tomorrow will be a very difficult day for me." He offered to order drinks, but she declined, saying that she wasn't a drinker. He told her, "This is your night off. We'll do whatever you want." He offered to give her a massage, and then he asked her to take off her dress and get into bed with him. She did what he asked, but she asked him if they could turn on the radio. Mark started running his fingers across her skin, and he says that her muscles were tensed up for about a half hour before she started to relax. He reportedly told her, "A real man doesn't have to take from a woman. He can give." Supposedly, the woman started to moan and seemed like she was starting to feel pleasure, and that's when Mark guided her hand onto his self, and he laid back and closed his eyes. Here's a little side note, and I actually didn't read this in this particular book. They covered this in the last podcast on the left. They did a pretty good episode on this. So supposedly, Mark had kind of a weird, interesting thoughts about sex. He considered himself to be an average heterosexual man, and while he enjoyed touching women and being touched by women, he did not enjoy sexual intercourse. He had only had sex a handful of times, even including his wife. There was something about the warm, wet feeling of entering a vagina that made him feel uneasy. Like actually scared that he was going to get swallowed up and disappeared. But what a way to go, right? Around 3 a.m., the woman got out of bed and put her dress back on. Mark again took note of the dress being the same color as the dress that Holden Caulfield's sex worker wore. He said to himself, "Synchronicity." He gave her $190 and walked her out. He then called his wife for the first time since he left Hawaii. So it's December 8th, 3 a.m. in New York time, and in Hawaii it's about 10 p.m. Gloria told Mark that she had just gone to bed and she was reading her Bible, and then she told him that he should work on his problems one by one, and perhaps he should start with getting back with Christ. He agreed, and he told her he has a little Bible on his nightstand that he's going to pick up and read. They hung up. He picked up the Bible to the New Testament book of John, and he wrote Lennon after Gospel according to John. So now it said, Gospel according to John Lennon. He then said to himself, "They're coming together, history and time." He closed the Bible and set his alarm for 9 a.m. and went to sleep. The next morning, still Monday, December 8th, Mark woke up early as his mind was racing too much to let him sleep in until his alarm. Before he left his room, he rearranged his things in a weird little semicircle, including his passport, an 8-track player of Todd Rundgren music, his little Bible open to the Gospel according to John Lennon. He also stood in front of the mirror and practiced pulling it out of his coat pocket and aiming it at his reflection and pulling the trigger like 5 times in succession, just kind of practicing. He then took out the 5 hollow point bullets that he had gone to Georgia for, and he loaded them into his gun. He said to his reflection, "The Catcher in the Rye of My Generation, Chapter 27. He knew this would be the last time that he would be seeing this room. He had said, "I practiced what it was going to look like when police officers came into the room. It was like I was going through a door, and I knew I was going to go through a door, the Poet's store, William Blake's store, Jim Morrison's store. It was like I was going through a giant door, and I was. I was leaving my past. I was leaving what I was, going into a future of uncertainty. There were tremendous feelings of Holden Caulfield and The Catcher in the Rye. The paragraphs and sentences of that book were flowing through my brain and entering my blood, influencing my thoughts and my actions. My very soul was breathing between the pages of The Catcher in the Rye." Before he left, he considered leaving behind a message, but he decided against it because he still needed to get a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, and he decided that the book would be his final message. He grabbed his copy of the Double Fantasy album and headed out to the Dakota. He walked a few blocks before finding a little stationery shop that had just one final copy of The Catcher in the Rye. He bought the book along with the pen, and when he left the store, he took them out and he wrote inside the cover, "This is my statement," with the word "this" underlined, and then he signed it, Holden Caulfield. After a moment, he added, "The Catcher in the Rye." It goes without saying that Mark was really intrigued by all these synchronicities between him and Holden Caulfield, and he read into them way too much. Like, the book would have a line like, "It was Monday and all, and pretty near Christmas, and all the stores would open." And Mark would be like, "Amazing, the coincidence is unreal." As he slid his new book into his coat pocket, he felt the words of J.D. Salinger mingle with his blood. He said, "I remember actually thinking perhaps I would become Holden Caulfield. Not that I would become crazy, I would actually become Holden Caulfield." So Mark goes back to the Dakota and he stands there waiting around for John Lennon to come out again. And as he's standing there, he remembers the movie Rosemary's Baby, which was filmed at the Dakota. For Mark, this is another synchronicity. Rosemary's Baby was directed by Roman Polanski. As you may know, Roman Polanski's wife was Sharon Tate, and she was murdered by members of the Manson family not long after Rosemary's Baby was released. The Manson family, you may remember, believed that the Beatles were commanding them through song to murder people and to start a race war. And this, the Manson family called Helter Skelter. Actually, they called it Helter Skelter because they were stupid. But Mark thought that this was really significant. The Beatles, Manson, Dakota connection all were one thing. What's interesting is that as Mark is standing in front of the Dakota pondering all these connections, who happens to walk by but Mia fucking Farrow, the lead actress to Rosemary's Baby. So Mark was like, oh my God, this is a sign. This was confirmation that he had to follow through with his plan. At about 10:30 a.m., Mark took out his copy of Catcher in the Rye and he started reading it again. He was so into his book that he barely noticed it when a cab pulled up and John Lennon got out and walked right past Mark and into the Dakota. The doorman was like, "Hey, did you see him? He just went in." And Mark was like, "Oh shoot, I guess I'll just have to keep waiting." He says he just knew that this wasn't the right time, and when the time is right, he'll know it. After waiting around for a while, he saw an older lady come around the corner with the child. Since Mark had been hanging out outside of the Dakota for a few days now, and he had been telling everybody who would listen about how he came here all the way from Honolulu, Hawaii to meet John Lennon and get his autograph, which he said in a southern accent, by the way, so everybody thought it was fucking weird that he told people he was from Hawaii. He had been talking to a woman named Jude and her friend Jerry. He had met them a few days before, and Jude was there, and she seemed to know this older lady because she smiled really big when she saw her, and they started a conversation. So Mark tried to stay close to Jude, acting like she knew her, and trying to kind of interject himself in the conversation. He looked at the child and smiled, and then Jude finally spoke up and introduced Mark to the woman, whose name was Helen Seaman. Helen was the nanny of the little boy, and the little boy was Sean Lennon, the son of John and Yoko. So Mark is standing here face to face with John Lennon's little boy and his nanny, and he kneels down and shakes the little boy's hand and says, "I came all the way across the ocean from Hawaii, and I'm honored to meet you." Around noon, Mark met Paul Goresh, who was a photographer. Mark approached him and asked him if he was waiting for John Lennon, and he said yes. He then asked him if he worked with John, and Paul said, no. Mark said, "I'm Mark. I'm from Hawaii." And then Paul said something about him having a southern accent, so he said, "Well, I was originally from Georgia." So then Paul said, "So where are you staying?" And Mark turned around real fast and said, "Why do you want to know?" All of a sudden, Mark was super on edge. He was nervous that people were going to figure out his plan, so he just snapped and he said, "Why the hell would you ask me that question?" So Paul was just like, "Forget it, dude," and he turned and walked away. After a while, though, all the other fans left and only Mark and Paul were left. So Mark ended up approaching him later and was like, "Listen, I'm sorry I snapped at you. I'm tired and the city is scary." Mark then noticed that the doorman happened to be switching shifts, and the new doorman who was coming out to work was Jose, and Mark had met him back in October. So Mark was like, "Hey, Jose, it's me, I'm back." They started chatting for a while. As always, Mark was very charming and educated and engaged in the conversation with Jose. Suddenly, Mark was distracted by a group of people laughing as they walked out of the Dakota. Before he got a chance to approach the group, a gray limousine pulled up to the curb and Jose stepped forward to open the door. As the group got into the limo, Mark heard a familiar voice with a British accent behind him. He turned around to see John Lennon and Yoko Ono. Mark froze. The photographer, Paul, actually nudged him and was like, "Hey, didn't you want an autograph? There he is." Mark quickly walked over to John, and without saying a word, he held out his album of Double Fantasy in front of John's face. John took it and signed it, "John Lennon, December 1980. He handed the album back to Mark and said, "Is that all you want?" Mark was stiff and frozen and just said, "Thanks. Thanks, John." John started walking away, and Mark heard a voice in his head saying, "Damn." Then he heard another voice, a child's voice. It was screaming, "No, you can have him now. Put your hand in your pocket. He's yours. He's mine. You promised. You bastard. Phony bastard. You promised." Another voice whispered, "He's a nice guy. He was courteous and polite. He was quite kind to you. You can go home now. You've seen him and it didn't happen. And now you can take your autographed album and you can go back home." And then the child said, "But he wasn't real. You know he wasn't real." Paul the photographer said, "Looks like you scored big time." And Mark said, "Gosh, back in Hawaii, they'll never believe I could meet John Lennon and get his autograph." Then Mark suddenly realized that Paul was snapping pictures, and he asked if he got any of him with John. Mark said, "I'll give you anything for that picture. Anything." Paul agreed to meet him the following day to give him the picture for $50. They kept waiting for a while, and Mark asked Paul if he had any idea how long it would be until they came back. Paul told him that if they didn't come back in a couple hours, they were probably recording and would be out all night. So at about 8 p.m., Paul decided that they weren't going to come back anytime soon, and he would come back the following day. Mark decided to stay and wait. Now we're at the evening of December 8th, 1980. John and Yoko left the recording studio right around 10 p.m. They were seen getting out of their gray limo in front of the Dakota at about 10:30 p.m. Mark was exhausted, and he recalls how the child in him and the adult in him were at a constant battle. When he saw a limousine pull up, he knew right away that John Lennon was inside of it. The adult in him was trying to turn around and call a cab and go home, and the child was screaming at him, "No, devil help me. Give me the power to do this. I want to be somebody. Nobody ever let me be anybody." The adult started to panic, and then he disappeared. The back door of the limo opened up, and Yoko stepped out, followed by John. Mark smiled and nodded to Yoko. She just looked forward and kept walking. John followed about 20 feet behind her, and as he's walking, it's like every step he takes is faster than the last. Mark was certain that John saw him and recognized him from earlier. John kept walking. His back is now towards Mark, and the child's voice inside of Mark's head said, "Do it, do it, do it, do it, do it." Mark aimed at John's back and pulled the trigger 5 times. Then, the child in Mark's mind disappeared and left him alone, holding the gun that just shot John Lennon. And Mark was frozen. John and Yoko had run inside. Jose, the doorman, was like, "Do you know what you've done? Get out of here, now." Jose actually shook the gun out of Mark's hands and kicked it across the driveway, and he called out for somebody else to grab it. Mark was like freaking out now. He actually thought that the hollow point bullets would kill John instantly. He thought that they would enter John's body and explode, and that he and John would both then disintegrate into the pages of The Catcher in the Rye. So now he's looking, John's not even there, and just nothing makes sense. And Mark now starts pacing back and forth, and he takes out The Catcher in the Rye and starts reading it. The police came and arrested Mark, still holding his book closely and saying, "Please don't hurt me." They put him in the back of a police car, and a whole crowd was looking at him through the window. He was suddenly anxious that an angry Beatles fan was going to start firing bullets at him in revenge. He prayed to God to turn back time as he tried to press his body on the floor of the car to avoid snipers. He kept repeating, "Please don't let anyone hurt me. I'm sorry I've caused you guys all this trouble." He heard the 2 policemen talking, and one said, "I told you. I knew something big was going to happen tonight. This is history, man." When Mark heard that, he perked right up and said, smiling, "I am the catcher in the rye." When John Lennon was shot, 4 of the hollow point bullets had exploded in his chest, severing his windpipe and destroying most of his throat. He was pronounced dead on arrival at Roosevelt General Hospital. Less than 2 hours later, Mark David Chapman had signed his handwritten confession at the police station. It took less than an hour for a reporter to call Gloria and inform her of her husband's crime. She was able to call the detective squad and speak to Mark, but before she did that, she turned on the recording device that Mark had gotten to record her phone calls. The only real significant thing about this call is that Mark was really calm. Like, he didn't seem to be freaking out. He was just telling her, like, to call the police to protect her from reporters, and that was it. In Mark's words, he said that this calmness in this kind of time was proof that he was a psychopath in this moment. Mark was taken to Bellevue Hospital to be examined for mental competence and to be held under suicide watch. He would go back and forth to Bellevue and Rikers Island before he was eventually sent to Attica. At Bellevue, he was first seen by psychiatrist Dr. Naomi Goldstein. In her handwritten notes of that interview, she wrote that he was exhausted, depressed, tearful at times, no evidence of hallucinations or delusions. However, patient is religious and feels he hears the voice of God, has heard it for years, has multiple suicide gestures, denies present suicidal thinking. She recalls that when she spoke to him, nothing remotely psychotic was seen in him. Even though he said he heard the voice of God, she said that a lot of non-psychotic people feel that they hear a voice or feel a spiritual presence. Anyway, Mark told her that he wanted to kill someone to stop his mind. He thought it would stop his life. Goldstein noted that he seemed to be possessed by symptoms of virtually every psychiatric malady in the book simultaneously, and yet he remained completely lucid. I mean, after everything was said and done, she said that the fact that he didn't show her any signs of hallucination or delusions, that really puzzles her. Mark had an insatiable need for attention and recognition, and he had grandiose visions of himself. She concluded that Mark was fit to understand the charges and cooperate in his own defense. Another doctor, Dr. Schwartz, concluded that Mark was schizophrenic after Mark told him about the world of the little people. He also said that Mark suffered from a narcissistic personality disorder that caused him to crave attention and fame. Some mental health professionals speculated that Mark actually believed himself to be John Lennon, which Mark denied. Dr. Schwartz said that Mark was confused about the issue. Mark and John both married Japanese women who were a few years older than they. Mark put John's name on his own name tag, and then he signed it in the logbook at his job right before he quit. And he was also trying to be a house husband just like John Lennon. Because of all of this, Schwartz theorizes that the murder may have been a surrogate suicide. Mark was subjected to vigorous psychological and neurological testing. The neurological tests were inconclusive, but they had pretty bizarre findings otherwise. They did the Rorschach ink blot tests, and Mark, looking at these ink blot tests, described scenes of bleeding female pelvic areas which had been shot. They wrote that his results betrayed, quote, a perception of woman as seductive and dangerous, oral aggression appeared to be associated with sex, and sex appeared to be perceived as of a conflicted nature. The patient impresses as fearful of sex, but as capable of being reassured temporarily by fantasies of sexual violence. Mark spoke about his sensitivity and intelligence, which he got from his mother, and how those things made him more of a man than any other men. Another doctor, Dr. Bloom, said that this all goes down to Mark's childhood. When his father would beat his mother and she would call to him for protection, Mark felt like he had a responsibility to his mother that he was unable to fulfill. Dr. Bloom said that these scars from childhood that were perhaps exacerbated by his drug use impaired his ability to control his impulses. He also said that Mark's spur-of-the-moment obsessions with art, finances, books, and other random things were signs of obsessive and compulsive behavior, which made it impossible for him to control things once the ball got rolling. At the end of the day, the 6 defense experts declared Mark David Chapman to be psychotic, 5 made a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, the 6th of manic depressive psychosis, and thus not criminally responsible for the murder. The 3 prosecution experts said that his mental illness fell within a range of personality disorder short of psychosis, declaring him responsible for the killing. In the weeks following Mark's arrest, he was depressed as hell because, well, he didn't turn into Holden Caulfield and melt into the book with John Lennon. Almost 2 months after the murder, Mark had an epiphany. He was like, oh my God, I know why I killed John Lennon. It's because I'm supposed to promote The Catcher in the Rye. He felt it with every fiber of his being that it was his calling to get everybody in the world to read Catcher in the Rye. Again, he wouldn't shut up about that stupid book. He actually read from it at his trial. Sometime early in 1981, Mark got a visit from one of the little people, an especially loyal minister who he called Robert. Remember, the little people were appalled about Mark's plan to kill John Lennon. So Robert came back and actually offered to reconvene the little people government to try to help Mark cope with what he had done. But Mark turned down the offer, saying that he was too ashamed. Mark pleaded guilty to the murder. After that, his identity of the Catcher in the Rye of his generation started to crumble, and Mark's mind went really dark again. At Rikers Island, he started to strip naked and call out to the devil again, and he destroyed television sets and radios and toilet facilities, everything that was near his cell. It took 8 guards to get him under control. They took him back to a cell where he continued to cry out to demons. He climbed the bars of his cage like a beast, chanting in tongues at another inmate that was nearby, and trying to sick demons on him. So this other inmate that was in there with him was named Craig Crimmins, and he was in there for murdering a young violinist. He recalled that Mark's demons started speaking to him in a high-pitched, fearful voice that mimicked the young woman that Craig had killed. And that this voice started cackling, saying, "You belong to our master, and your soul will roast in eternity in the flames of hell." Craig Crimmins actually got his lawyer to go to court to move him from that cell block and have him protected from Mark's demons. At one point, Mark was injected with a potent antipsychotic drug, and he suffered a violent reaction where his head, throat, and vocal apparatus were all paralyzed. After that, he promised to confine the demons going forward, but the demons didn't leave for a few years. In the summer of 1981, Mark was moved to the Attica Correctional Facility. Gloria quit her job and moved to Attica, and she visited him almost every day. She stuck by him to this day. There was another occasion where the prison staff bent Mark over a bed and pulled down his pants, and the nurse pulled out a hypodermic needle, and Mark said, "Break that needle off in my ass. Break it off there. Just stick it up in there and break it off." Mark started to give himself exorcisms while he was in Attica, with the help of a minister who agreed to pray outside of the prison at designated times. Mark says that he vomited 7 evil spirits that evaporated into the walls of his cell. According to Mark, his demons disappeared in 1985. In 1992, Mark David Chapman did an interview with Larry King. He did it from the Attica Correctional Facility. It's a really long interview. If you want to see it, I linked it on the episode page on brokenlimelight.com. Mark David Chapman has been eligible for parole since the year 2000, but he has been denied every time. That's 11 times so far. His 12th parole hearing is scheduled for August 2022. Gloria, to this day, has never left his side. They get conjugal visits once a year where they spend 44 hours together in a prison trailer, having sex and making pizzas. She's confident that he's going to be free one day and able to spend the rest of his days with her. So for perspective, they were only married for 18 months, and he was horrible to her. Like, this loyalty is unreal. There's one more thing I want to add, and I actually read it in this one documentary, so I don't know how true this is, but supposedly, Mark had a list of substitute celebrities who he would kill if he couldn't get John Lennon. The next person on the list was Walter Cronkite, then Johnny Carson, George C. Scott, Jackie Kennedy Onassis, or Marlon Brando. Supposedly these were all potential targets. Apparently he planned to kill George C. Scott during a show. He was just going to stand up in the middle of the show and fire into him. Now, as if Mark hadn't done enough already, in 1981, another 25-year-old man was inspired by John Lennon's death to assassinate President Ronald Reagan. This man was named John Hinckley Jr., and he became obsessed with the 1976 movie Taxi, where Robert De Niro plots to assassinate the president. This guy, John Hinckley Jr., also became obsessed with Jodie Foster, who was about 18 at the time. He actually stalked her for months. When she started going to Yale University, he moved to Connecticut and started stalking her. He started calling her and leaving all these messages on her answering machine, and he was sending her letters, and ultimately he decided that he couldn't wait any longer to impress her. On March 30th, he shot Ronald Reagan. Reagan survived and went on to finish his term. Jodie Foster was understandably traumatized by this, but we will discuss that another time. All right, so that's the story of John Lennon and his death and inside the mind of Mark David Chapman. Before I go, I just want to read to you one little quote. This is about the Beatles. This was from Billboard.com. It says, "By any measure, no one comes close to matching the success of the Beatles' primary songwriters. The dichotomy between Paul McCartney's optimism and John Lennon's realism always pushed each songwriter to best the other, resulting in an unprecedented collaboration that yielded 180 songs, the most albums sold by any artist, and a still unbroken record of 20 number ones on the Billboard Hot 100. Lennon said he wished he could write a pop song like McCartney. McCartney said he always wanted Lennon's steely, skeptical look at sacred institutions. The combination remains the best there ever was." Okay, that's everything for today. Thank you so much for sticking around and listening to this long-ass story. But man, that guy's brain was bonkers, right? I didn't know half of that. If you enjoyed this podcast, please tell your friends and consider leaving me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or on brokenlimelight.com. Remember, you can always go to brokenlimelight.com, and there you can find an almost complete transcript of this episode, along with pictures, sometimes interview videos. And I have merch! Okay guys, until next time, bye! Have you ever thought about starting a podcast but don't know where to start? Let me help you out. Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. It has everything you need to record, distribute, and monetize your podcast, and it's also free. Anchor has creation tools which allow you to record or edit either on your computer or directly from your phone. Once you have your episodes recorded, Anchor will take care of distributing it to platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcast, and a ton of others. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Today's episode is brought to you by Hunt a Killer. Hunt a Killer is a monthly mystery subscription box that's truly one of a kind. It's basically like a true crime case in a box. It comes with case files, codes to decipher, detailed backgrounds about the suspects and the victims. There's evidence for you to evaluate. It tells an immersive story of a whole crime case from beginning to end. It's kind of like an escape room in a box. You can do this by yourself, or you can team up with a buddy, or you can do it for like a game night or even a date night. You can take a little break from technology and immerse yourself fully into this box, or if you prefer to be a more high-tech investigator, you can join online communities and talk to other Hunt a Killer players about clues and stuff. Hunt a Killer also shares part of the proceeds to the Cold Case Foundation, so your purchase actually helps with real-life cold cases. The best news is that Broken Limelight listeners get 20% off of their first subscription box. So go get started now at huntakiller.com. And don't forget to use the code BROKENLIMELIGHT to get your 20% off. That's Broken Limelight, all one word.